Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Let's get ready to rumble.
You feeling like a fight today?
No, I just feel like I've never used that one, and it's a pretty cultural savvy thing.
I mean, some people would probably be very aware of it.
Yeah.
I wonder, like, when you, like, is Gen Z as...
Here's why I think they are.
Okay.
Because they got that guy. I don't even know what his name is. Someone can go Google it. But he's on Crumble commercials. So
The let's get ready to rumble guy?
Before the Super Bowl, he was like, let's get ready to crumble.
Oh,
I get it.
Yeah, that's good.
And I like them. Crumble cookies.
Yeah, we know. We are aware. We haven't had a menu update in a while, but...
Have you had them recently?
Difficult. It's been a few weeks. I'm
trying to cut back.
I'm trying to cut back on them.
Really?
You know, it's tough.
Did you give them up for...
No, I did not. Michael Buffer.
Yeah, that's
way.
it.
And I'm pretty sure he did. Didn't he do WWE? And then did he do some... Why do I feel UFC, but I don't
That
know.
is a trademarked catchphrase, so I am
Oh, is it?
hoping...
Are we going to get a copyright claim on this?
I don't know. Austin?
Yeah.
He said
He's
stop.
nodding his head yes. He's sending the copyright claim now. He's
wants to
alerting
go
the authorities.
Fix his fence. So let's get this over with.
All right.
All right. Well, yeah, here we are. Another podcast and another voicemail is what I'm led to believe that Alex has prepared for us today.
Here it is.
Uh-huh.
Hey, podcast people. This is Jess's baby sis, and I am calling because I'm curious, if you were all trapped on a desert island together, who do you think would be the most likely to survive?
Wow.
Again, if you're trapped on a desert island, who would be the most likely to survive, given your current survival skills, wilderness abilities? I'm very curious. Also, shout out to Jess. She's my favorite podcast member.
Yeah.
No offense, Eric and Alex.
I hope so.
But she's great. So let me know who you think would survive. Thanks, guys.
Shout out to Jess. I agree.
Wow, that's fun.
Shout out to Jess.
Shout out. Thank you.
Who would survive? I've watched a lot of that show Alone. You know, the one where they have to try to survive the longest. Not the Naked and Afraid, but Alone. It's like they don't have to be naked on that one.
Is that the one where they drop them off?
Yeah, stranded
at a random location.
Very isolated. They have to like build shelter and hunt food. I've watched.
I think that kind of stuff is interesting.
So I mean, if I'm just gonna take my knowledge from that show, I feel like that bumps me up. I've watched a lot of the Doomsday Preppers show as well.
Okay.
So I just feel like my media consumption has helped.
I think
me
we
a
all
little.
build our case for why we would be, and then maybe we can see if...
Okay, that's my.
I think
case.
it does kind of come down to like what all of our experiences are, and then
maybe the
it kind of turns a little
can
competitive.
can actually vote.
Alex's
based on
his
our-
eyes are already like shaking a little bit because he's like, I can
shaking.
see he's competitive. We know
like
it.
TPM kind of stuff going on right now. Like my eyes are shaking.
When she said that we were all stranded on an island, I was concerned she was going to say which one of us were going to survive, as in we were going to eat the others.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that what
that
this
was
is?
definitely a cannibalistic kind of question.
Oh, I did not go there, but
Okay.
No, we'll bury one.
I was thinking like the other two kind of wither away.
Just tell us why.
Okay, I will say that I'm not trying to take over what you were saying, Eric, so maybe you should go first because I don't want you to think. I have watched a fair share of reality TV. Yeah, the Doomsday Preppers. I feel like I've watched every season of Survivor. I've caught up on this season.
Okay.
I also have my gold award in Girl Scouts, which was the equivalent of the Eagle Scout.
Is that
So
for
I've
like
done my-
field dressing a deer or something?
I have done that too, but
Okay.
on a separate occasion.
Oh,
I'm serious
wow.
that I have.
Okay, yeah. You're getting
That's
up there.
true.
Your ranking. Remember on Doomsday Preppers, they'd give them a ranking of survival. Your ranking is getting up there right now.
Feel like I don't necessarily like doomsday prep, but I keep the right stuff around. So I think that is in my favor. So I have like the things that I need that are going to keep me sustained for long periods of time.
Okay. But this is on a desert island, so you won't
I know.
have
Who
any
knows
of that.
what's going to be in my purse
Oh,
if
that's true.
happen to have that.
It's like goldfish crackers. Juice boxes.
Yeah.
Alex,
I also feel like I'm pretty determined. I've had 3 kids.
okay.
I'm not afraid
Yeah.
of pain.
yeah. Your
I feel
case is
feel
built.
like when it came down to it, I can be like I'd be pretty ruthless. Like I can be pretty competitive too. So now I feel like I'm just trying to make myself sound
Austin
intimidating.
you're building your case for him.
I already feel like I lost. So
Here's the deal.
I can keep
there's
going.
reality
I can keep
TV
going.
shows, and then there's us doing it. You know,
yeah. Have you been doing it a lot?
yeah. I have been. I'm camping this
What do you-
weekend.
okay.
For example, with my son and Trail Life. Give a shout out to
Eric, don't help
Trail
him
Life.
with things we know he's doing.
Also, was a Boy Scout. A couple of the advantages I think I have is I have lived many a days because some kidney issues I had as a child. I wet the bed a lot when I was growing up, and so I've lived many a days like being comfortable in my own urine and soiling myself.
I was like,
Okay.
how is he parlaying this into
do you
an
really
argument?
have to if you go
I-
back to pioneer days, like you just find a leaf. You don't have to see what I mean? A good
Also-
survivalist knows you grab a leaf.
Only Alex could
You dig
turn
a hole.
I wet the bed as a kid into I could survive in the wilderness.
Also,
What?
who's gonna bury you guys? I need to be the official person. If you guys if you let me go early, how are you gonna have a proper burial before
ain't worried
God?
about
And
it. Ain't
I
worried
I don't know.
about-
What would you use as a shovel? That's a
shovel?
good question.
There's many things you can use as a shovel.
Exactly. So
Conch
what would
shell.
you use? Don't help him, Eric.
Oh, sorry.
We're trying to pick off the first one.
Here's
A
where
femur.
I will. Part of it is also being able to talk about where your weaknesses lie, and mine are the sun. The sun
Now
would
I've-
just bake me. One time I went just for like a couple days to the beach, and if I don't have sunscreen, I couldn't walk. I had blisters all over my feet, and so if I would have to find a shady place, but luckily I've learned that about myself.
You are
and
a
so
shady
so I can survive.
But you also do the intermittent fasting, so I feel like you
Okay.
could go a while without
Yeah.
eating, so that probably helps.
I
This is what I'm
could-
gonna say.
I could go a very long time without.
If we're
before I had to eat
going
you
up
guys.
against, I feel like you're auditioning for a reality show,
Yeah.
and I'm on the island.
Okay.
That's how I feel.
Yeah.
I feel
I'm
like
not
And I'm
trying
just
to-
watching. I'm just
chess.
watching on the couch.
I'm playing chess and you're playing checkers is what I feel like while we're out there. So Austin, can you just point? Can you
Wait,
point?
Eric didn't get a chance.
He
to
did.
say
I
it.
did. I said
you?
I watched TV. That was my argument.
I feel like Eric, you're too humble sometimes,
I
and you
could-
sell
I would
yourself
st-
short. Because
I
I think
would-
you're amazing as a human.
I think
Your
I'd get
shirt is
I'd
the
get,
most fit for it.
I'd
right
get
now.
That's
creative.
true.
I'd get creative. I'd be way more creative than the average person when it comes to surviving. But
You could rip those sleeves off.
I'd be the first to make like the Wilson volleyball to talk to, and like hopefully that would help me not be as hungry. I don't know. I don't like killing things. Like I'm not a hunter. I don't enjoy that. One time I had to put a mouse out of its misery because
Oh,
it was
no.
stuck in a glue trap. Never will do that again. That was so.
But are you a gatherer?
I am a
'Cause
gatherer.
that's-
I
'cause-
mean, I got the body type for it. That's for sure.
Gather it up.
Berries and nuts. That's my diet. Austin, give us a
I
winner.
want you guys to read this. He sent me a Teams message.
Oh, he did? Okay.
here, but I don't want to be the one that reads
Okay.
the Teams message
Okay.
to me.
Wait, where does it say? I can't wait.
This is
Oh no,
just
that's
me.
the wrong. Oh, Alex wins.
No.
Wow.
Why?
It says you
And
win.
you know what? I refuse to let Austin be the judge.
Yeah, I refuse. I'm
because
gonna
there was
vote.
no context to that. I say
I say Jess
let's
wins.
throw it to the uncomfies.
Have you? Yeah.
The uncomfies. Did we settle on that?
I don't know, but I like it.
I need
It's
to put
endearing.
a poll out there on the
Have
Instagram.
you? Have you filled dressed a deer?
That's true.
Alex?
I really
I
have.
have. Yes.
Okay.
Have you really?
Are you kidding me?
No, because sometimes in your competitiveness,
Sutton, Nebraska. I grew up going deer hunting, pheasant hunting, Sutton, Nebraska.
Even the way he's saying
You meet
hunting
anybody
without the
from-
G.
You meet anybody from Sutton, Nebraska, they will know. I gathered there for that pancake feed as a little lad, as one of those Ely's. We ate
you
as many
Irish,
pancakes as we could take. We would have some Coogan
Okay.
pie once we got those pheasants and those deer.
I could start throwing around what my family does too.
I'm gonna be honest. I thought
getting
Austin
This
was
is
not
just
gonna
bringing
vote
out
for
like
me,
Alex and I's like
Competitive?
very under the river
Under the
sibling
river.
relationship undercurrent.
Yeah, and
So we
across
just
the
need to
tracks.
stop because we could. I won't give up, and neither will he. So
Okay. All right. Well, I vote for you, Jess. So
Thank you.
I think
That's
it's a
the
tie.
only vote
I think
I
it's a
care
tie
about.
right now. I discredited myself because hey, if I had a gun, I'm a crack shot, so I could shoot the thing, I guess, but that's where it ends.
And you, maybe you have it. Maybe that's a day that you
don't have-
and at
Yeah,
the end of the
hang around with
day,
a gun.
Yeah.
Alex doesn't care which way the
Yeah.
toilet paper goes. So
Yeah. I
that's
don't know.
always kind
So
of
I'll be safe. Which way the leaf goes
Yeah,
is
it doesn't matter
will
as
be
much.
good. I can wet myself and I can wipe no matter what.
Yeah.
So
stop.
All right.
I think that's what won it for me.
Yeah, that's really it. All right. Well, glad that we settled.
I didn't see that coming.
It's the most challenging things that we cover here, and we have definitely settled that one. People say we never walk away from conversation with a definitive answer, and I mean,
Here we go.
We didn't.
we
but-
didn't. That's true.
And
'Cause
we're
now
Except-
we're saying it's. Well, I'm saying Jess, Austin's saying Alex,
I also think Carl would vote for me
Mm-hmm.
if he watched this.
and speaking of Carl, he's going to be joining us
Doc-
very
I'm
gonna
soon.
ask him.
Dr.
Doctor.
Karl Pagenkemper, he is going to be joining us as we have this conversation sparked by the recent movie that's on the film festival circuit right now called 1946, and there's also articles about this discussion around the word homosexual and when it was added to the Bible. Carl's got a lot of knowledge on this topic, and he's going to bring that and share it with us. So stay tuned for that. Dr. Karl Pagenkemper, you have joined us today because we are under the assumption that maybe you can give us some clarity on this topic. And that's the topic of the word homosexual being added to the Bible in 1946. There has been a trend on TikTok for, I would say, at least the last 12 months, if not longer, of people talking about this movie that's going to be released. It's currently on like a film festival tour. There are trailers out there for it. It's called 1946. And the premise of this film is to say that, religion and politics got together and decided to add the term homosexual into the Bible. There's a lot more to, discuss around this, but we thought, hey, Karl, he can answer some of these questions. Maybe just give us just a little bit of insight. What you, if people don't know your background as well, what kind of gives you some authority to speak into this?
My terminal work was mostly in New Testament studies. I have degrees in Hebrew, but my terminal work has been in New Testament religious studies. So I guess I have a PhD in Greek.
Yeah.
Greek exegesis, technically. So I guess I have something to say, but the history of this discussion is pretty pertinent because in 1946, the Revised Standard Version imported the word homosexual for the first time in that particular translation. And it tends to, I remember the early New American Standard picked it up because it was picking up words that I was trying to figure out how do we talk about it. And, of course, even today, the language of homosexual and homosexual activity, which is now more likely to talk about it that way now, they're wrestling with what it is, what the words mean in the text. So they used the word homosexual for the first time, at least in the Bible. But the idea of sexual sin between men was well ensconced, back into the King James Version, so they understood that. But often under the words like sodomite, and typically the language is two words. At least in 1 Corinthians 6, you have two words for that are used here. One is the word malakos, which is the word for soft, usually understood to be the passive partner in homosexual activity. And arsenokoitos, which is one of those fun words that Paul may have invented. I don't know that that's true, but he may have. I'm not aware of it extant in any Greek manuscripts before Paul, which is made up of two words, which we know really well even from the Old Testament. They're usually separated, but here they're brought together. The word arson means man, male, specifically male, not just anthropos, but arson is a male with all the appropriate accoutrements. And koitos, which is technically the word for laying next to, but the implication of sexual behavior. So you have those two words brought together, and they're wrestling with how do we express this in a contemporary way in his 40s. And there now, of course, there's a little bit of pushback because the concern of some is homosexuality itself sin. A sin itself to be a homosexual, or is it just the activity? And then it moves into things like the catamites and the particular pederasty, which is where men played with boys. And that's pretty much throughout the Greek Greek area and Russia, Rome as a whole. Men with boys, particularly prepubescent boys, and you can see it in artwork and pottery work. It's not the thing I would recommend. This is not safe for work type stuff. But it does. It's pretty graphic, and in the culture we know it exists. So some people are concerned. That's what Paul is specifically talking about.
It's pedophilia.
Yeah, pedophilia, but it's pretty graphic in that sense. But it's particularly because of that age differential, where you'll have a male who might be in his early 20s who is behaving with a prepubescent male, and it was actually viewed as an acceptable behavior. Where it got to be unacceptable, and this is going to be a little bit of a twist here, was because in the ancient world, domination was a gendered thing. And for a male to be dominant over another male often was embarrassing to the male who was being dominated. But when it was a boy, it was a little more acceptable. But it varies. I mean, inside the Greek Empire, it's all across the map as far as actual acceptance, and some didn't like it at all. Some actually were rejected. But in Sparta, for instance, it was a good thing to have if you have a male consort that was, you're training them up in the ways of behavior.
And why is it just males that are used as reference?
Great question, because they did understand female lesbian behavior. And you see that in Paul in Romans 1. And they understand it, but it was more acceptable in many ways. That's why Romans 1 is so jarring, because he starts with women, and everybody goes, what? Because guys with guys, more normal. And the real reason, I think, is because men tend to live more public lives. They're out and about more often, unless you have money. Now, if you got money and you're female, you can get out and about just fine. But for most men, the power, that's why men could have more than one sexual partner as a female as well. Not always. Some guys wasn't a big deal. But people who had money and power, they could get out and about because women were more available outside. But women with women is more, the world is a little more private for them. So you don't see them in the public in the same way.
So in a simplistic form, the answer to the question was the English word homosexual added to the Bible in 1946.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's yes. But there's a lot of caveat, as to,
yes,
how much was that word even used pre-1946 in culture in general?
Right.
How much? And so
yes,
this is an argument that without the proper, look at text criticism and things like that, could be had about a lot of words throughout history. And so, but why this is so central to, I think, get it right is because it does have, especially cultural, some prevailing, thoughts about what God, we overlays religion on, this acceptable behavior and things like that. And that's where it gets a lot more complex.
Yeah, this is actually not a text critical issue formally, because this is an interpretive issue. This is, what do we do with the words on a page that we understand? And is this some sort of ritualized, religious pederasty or something like that, or not? And the words are not unknown to the Greek world or the Hebrew world. The Hebrew world understood it as well, but the general condemnation of that was pretty clear. And Paul does not really change that. He is a Jew, and the Jewish world is going to be resistant. He's very aware of the social world around him. And Paul is more aware than most of us suspect, because he comes out of a Greco-Roman culture background. But he's a Jew by religious proclivity, so you don't really see an undoing. In fact, the fact that there's so little is said about it was not because nothing should have been said about it, it's because they didn't need to. There's so many passages and so much content related to marriage and sexual behavior that throughout this canon that it does legitimately say certain kinds of behavior should be detestable, but so is murder. So were a lot of things that were viewed as detestable. You didn't touch dead bodies, serious stuff. So they viewed that. They understood it existed, but that wasn't to be true in the community of faith.
I think one important caveat to make is any argument made on this podcast is based on just the trailer and other things that people have spoken about it. We have not actually seen the film, so there may be some nuance there that we are not addressing directly. So.
Well, and that's true, and the trailers are sufficient to suggest that there was a debate about this discussion, and there were individuals, particularly who were themselves gay, were troubled by how it came about and the discussion, and years down the line discovered maybe there was more complex discussion. And the conception of homosexual as an orientation, as opposed to homosexual behavior, was part of the discussion as well. And the truth of the matter is that nobody really wants to be told they're morally off base. I don't. Mm-hmm. And so we're looking for help to, especially when we ask the question, is sexual orientation, first of all, is it a thing? We think it is. I do. But is that itself a sinful thing? And in the 40s and 50s, the cultural wave against that was pretty strong. So.
Yeah, and I think that orientation conversation is a fascinating one because usually we pit homosexual versus heterosexual. We use terms like straight in that conversation, and then we make assumptions that anybody maybe that is straight, quote unquote, is not deviant, like they don't have desires that are deviant from what God says is best, So for me, like I am not a big fan of the word straight because it implies that like somehow I have it all together and that I get to choose whatever I want to do sexually, and I don't have to say no to things that are happening in my life that are deviant from what I see as God's plan in Scripture. And so I think that's a big part for me when we have these conversations, when we pit maybe the idea or the phrase homosexual versus straight, because it can lead us down to a lot of false assumptions about what it means to, quote unquote, be walking on the straight and narrow, or other ways that we get the word straight tied into there. But I think part of this conversation, one, is clearly it's nuanced. Like watching a 90-second TikTok, though it might be convincing and compelling, there's so much more that goes into study of these types of things. Another trend right now on TikTok is, people are all of a sudden discovering, that there's verses missing in the Bible, and they're freaking out, and there's conspiracies linked to it. I know a big one to Matthew 17:21 is that in most modern Bibles, you're not going to find Matthew 17:21. You'll look in it, it'll say Matthew 17:20 and then 22, and they say 21 is, but this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. It's talking about demons in that passage. And so some people are like, God knows prayer and fasting is so strong, and so these people are taking that out. They're trying to take the power away, that was clearly there. And so I think it gets a lot more complicated when we have these kinds of questions. And that's a compelling argument. If I open my Bible, I'm like, what the heck? People told me this is true. Where did this go? I can start to make assumptions, like somebody really did take something out of the Bible. I go there, it's clearly missing. It's obvious. Somebody took something from the Bible. And I think that should caution us in some ways as people that are Christians that look at that and like, you should at least say, what happened here, right?
There is an irreducible complexity to this discussion. When you say nuanced answer, you're right. There is a sense in which it is more complicated than it sounds. The two major things you be aware of is that there are two major streams of textual traditions that come to us. And what I mean by that is you have the King James tradition, and you've kind of got everybody else. In 1611, the King James Version comes out based on about 8 manuscripts. Might even be less than that. And because that's all they had, and they were trying to take manuscripts and figure out what would the English look like if it was translated from the Greek and not from the Latin anymore. And they created a text, and basically I think it was the third edition by Erasmus, shows up, and he did several more, by the way. But that particular edition was the one that became authorized by King Jimmy himself. That became based on relatively late manuscripts. Very little manuscript study had been done at that point. And then other things started to show up, and a whole new tradition, what we'll call the critical text, is a nice way of saying, okay, those are pretty good, but we've got manuscripts go back to the 3rd and 4th century, and these are mostly 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, right up to the 15th century worth of manuscript copies. So what you got is a ton of manuscripts. Now we got a couple thousand of them. None of them are identical. And when you have that many, and none of them are identical because they don't have Xerox machines. That was a more recent addition. But some scribes are trying to be really careful, and some scribes, we can look at them and say, gosh, that guy was sleepy that day. He just skipped over a sentence, or he skipped a line. There's only so many ways to vary a given text. You can omit something, you can add something, you can transform something, or you can put a whole different word in. There's only so many ways to transform a text. And then you ask the question, well, what are the units of transformation, or what are the units? And so occasionally what happens in a big picture is a verse shows up from a parallel text in another book. You've written this text many, many times. You remember I've read Matthew, and I've read Mark, and I've read Luke. There's something I need to, okay, and if I'm writing along, I put it in. Or I take it out, or I skip line. It just happens. And when I was a kid, memorizing Bible, one of the ways you memorize is you start to write things out. So if I want to memorize a chapter, I would deliver newspapers in the morning, and I'd pull this stuff out, and as I'm throwing papers out along the way, I'd try to memorize these things. I'd write it up by hand, and you'd be surprised how many times I had to write it out to get it right. So over time, scholars are pretty capable. Some are very capable, some are not so, and some of it's even tough to write. I mean, you ever read block print on papyri that is 1,800 years old, or
all the time
script? Exactly. It takes a guy who actually knows what they're doing in papyrology, and to be able to look at a text and even tell what date it is simply by looking at it. So when you have that kind of variation, the challenge of a text critic is to ask, what's the most responsible original text that makes the most sense? So a scribe, for instance, in history, is more likely to add something than take something away. He's more likely to simplify something than make it harder, because they're orthodox. They want to believe in the text. They want to support it. So what this comes down to is a series of manuscripts that are all over the empire, and the King James Version is the one that tends to have lasted the latest into the century. So we actually had them when King Jimmy is putting his stuff out. Erasmus is doing his handbooks. And it's over the years we found a bunch more, and sometimes we discover that in the manuscript evidence, some of these things just disappear. The earliest manuscripts do not have the ending of Mark, for instance. They just don't. I had one of those experiences. I was teaching Greek in Cal, and I had a bunch of students who had done some Greek work, and they wanted to just do some translation work. So we get together every week. We spend about an hour every week, and we translated through the book of Mark over the year. And I remember getting to chapter 16 of Mark right at verse 8, and all these guys, they're only a year and a half into Greek. They're reading it along. They're getting used to the rhythm of the Greek, and they get to verse 8, and they go, this doesn't feel the same. It suddenly shifts. And these are not highly trained scholars. These are just kids that have gotten used to reading it. Just like when you read a book, they've seen it often enough, and something felt jarring in the Greek, and they go, it doesn't feel the same, does it? Okay, you got two questions. One is it original to Mark? And the answer feels like no. And the second question is, should it be included in our Bible? Mm-hmm. Which is a different question. And so the church is always, what they typically do is they put brackets around it, because the answer is, we don't want to take anything away from you, but we want you to know that we're doubting that it actually should be here originally. And the ending of Mark is an unknown.
So because I think that it starts like for
how to get in.
The normal person on the street, like that starts to get confusing.
Yes.
And I think that that's a big place where people also question.
Right.
So it's like, where do we understand like how the scholars came up with what is more likely to be original, what's authentic, what belongs in the Bible, what doesn't?
Sure. Well, at least the New Testament, the Old Testament is a little more complicated because it has fewer manuscripts. But when we think of the New Testament, you got 2,500 texts in front of you, and you take the same verse out of a bunch of them, and you just lay them side by side. You can pretty well quickly tell which was left out, which was added, just because you're looking at 300 copies of this
So they're
thing.
looking at consistency.
Yeah, and each manuscript has a style and a script. And its age matters. We typically want to look at earlier ones more often than later ones, because later ones have a tendency over time to get corrupted. And so we have a very, very responsible early 2nd century manuscript in front of us now, and I can look at it here.
Okay.
Now, that said, we don't have anything that I know of that goes any earlier than about 125, maybe a little earlier. We're not, and to be honest with you, we're guessing. Every now and then somebody wants to say something that's even earlier than that, and it drives the headlines, both in the popular as well as the scholars are trying to figure, is this even likely? And then they go, nah, that's a copy. It's coming later. And so that happens all the time.
I think there's obviously critics that, as we dive more into Scripture and so on and so forth, claim, and rightfully so, that there's contradictions or maybe inconsistencies. We're even talking about there's contradiction or maybe inconsistencies in the way that the Bible's been put together, at least over time and as we've learned more. So how do we respond to these claims and claim orthodoxy still? I think there's that difference. Like, we believe the Bible was divinely given, but then humanly, translated. So divinely transmitted, but maybe humanly translated. And then you've got words like errant, inerrant, and things like that pop up in there. So how do we respond to maybe some of the criticisms around that idea, or those thoughts that are, hey, it's inconsistent and contradicts itself, therefore it's trash?
Well, I typically, and I want to say this a little on the simplistic side, but I think when I think about who Jesus is, historically we've confessed both the humanity and the divinity of Jesus. And yet we would say that he is divine and he's human and he's fully human. That's the confession. And he's fully divine. And all those things slammed together in the same person, in some sense, not confused. we sort of understand. I think we take the text in a similar fashion. We see it as sourced in God, yet using human instruments to create it. So we use words like inerrant, and I'm kind of with others. I'm not real happy with the term inerrant because it's proving a negative. I want to rather say when the Bible speaks, it tells me the truth whenever it speaks. It just tells me the truth. Now, I may interpret it poorly, which is a different art. Actually, establishing the text is a mechanical thing. I can hang around with a bunch of pagans and figure out what the likely, did I say that right? Pagans, like me. People who are unbelievers can look at the text and establish the original text. The problem is rarely at that level. It's usually at the interpretive level. So how do I understand? What does that mean? So that's one way. Now, you're talking about other things like, are there contradictions in particular days of the month or how many people died? Yeah, there's a whole rat's nest of approaches to those things. Sometimes texts are corrupted. We don't know. Some things about numbers, for instance, large numbers. How many people died when that wall fell over? How many thousands of people? There's some language like when they use the word thousand. How many is 1,000? Well, the truth is it could also refer to a squad. It's one of those things. We understand the interpretive is harder. So if we think, we really don't know some of the big numbers. And like David, who kills his tens of thousands, how many did he actually kill? There's a hyperbole that's at work constantly.
You use the word corrupted. It makes me wonder, like, would people would maybe develop an argument?
Right.
Okay, well then, if it's corrupted,
right,
then it's not fully inspired by God.
Yeah, and traditionally the argument from the Jewish on that the purity of the text was from the hand of God. That is out of the scribe. So the original manuscripts are understood to be accurate. But copies, short of Xeroxing, you're going to get human copies. The Jews understood that and actually had ways of trying to offset that. They had special ways to keep track of manuscripts, and they did it very carefully. A good rabbi, for instance, could take a manuscript that he'd been studying. The joke was you could take a pin and run it through the top 10 pages, and he could tell you from where it went through what the words were behind it on the next page, They had it very well mapped out, very carefully, very precisely, and of course, they don't have television to distract them. They can actually TikTok to mess with them. They can actually do that sort of stuff. They knew it quite well. But we always think about the original manuscripts. We're not thinking about the copies because, quite frankly, if I just look at different English copies, we recognize there's differences. And I'm trying to remember what century it was, but they actually came out with what they call the Immoral Bible, where they forgot to put the word "not" in front of "thou shalt commit adultery."
Oh yeah.
And it was a mistake. And I don't know if they made a couple hundred of them or not, but it's probably worth a lot of money now.
But I think a lot of times an atheist is building the case against it, going, okay, well, it's not inspired by God. Then you just stated that. So, how do we balance that as Christians when we're having these real world conversations with people who are struggling with their faith, and they're not just trying to have a gotcha argument, but they are truly concerned. You're putting a lot of trust into these documents that have had a lot of human interaction and translation. It seems inevitable that there are mistakes. So how can I trust that this is something that I should put my faith in?
This is I want to say it's a pretty big and it's nuanced discussion. And I'm not going to give you a definitive answer. I mean, the truth is, I sat in classes where people were dismantling the historical value of certain paragraphs of Jesus' life. And the arguments were solid. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, okay, I'm going to listen to that. I'm going to hold it in abeyance for a while. I want to go read this and process this on my own. And it's a funny thing, whenever I read the text, a bell goes off and says, by the way, dude, this text owns you. It's still mine. They can dismantle it, and I keep coming back and saying, nah, that's just an argument. And I read it, and a bell goes off. This is Luther. Martin Luther's notion about what canon, we read it, and a bell goes off. That sounds like God. Mm-hmm. And so when we read it, we hear the word of God, and the early church hears it. That's why the specific books come together. They don't hear it with the Gospel of Thomas. They're curious about didache, for instance, and you don't know that because, well, you might. But, I mean, a lot of people don't know. There's a whole nexus of literature, and once we drew the boundary lines, we forgot them all. But we accept the things that are in. If you were to read First Clement or the didache, you'd say those sound amazing. But we didn't assign it to the canon, so we ignore it. So there's a lot of texts that are out there. There's a bounded set in canon, the Bible, what fits. And then there's what we call a centered set. What does it point toward? And so both of those things are at work when you're establishing what canon is. So I'm kind of jumping around a bunch of things.
You're just dodging my question, Karl.
Why would I? Because I keep reading the text and it keeps banging me over the head. Yeah. And when I trust it, I find it works.
And I'm just, again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Please do.
But to me, that sounds like a personal conviction and not something that God wrote.
Yep, it is. Mm-hmm. Because God comes along and says, this owns you. I study the text, and by the way, the text is busy studying me.
Yeah.
And I hear the voice of God. Now, the canon, the New Testament is going to say that without the Spirit, it all appears to be foolishness to him. That's the point of the end of First Corinthians 2. It all appears foolishness to him. But something happens when a person trusts Christ. Some light changes. Yeah. And I remember reading a commentary on Genesis years ago. One of the brilliant Old Testament scholars, a guy by the name of Cassuto, and I remember reading it at the front of the introduction. He goes, all this to him is mythology. He doesn't believe it, but it's brilliant and it's beautiful, and it frames up mythology in ways that I wish were true. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't believe it. So you and I come to the text, and we're predisposed because the Spirit of God compels us to listen, and then we hear the voice of God speaking through it. Now, if you're neo-Orthodox and you like Karl Barth, you could say God could also speak to a song too. But in the written word in front of us, we keep hearing God's voice. It rings with authority. And the church keeps hearing it. That's why books like Hebrews become canon, because we're not sure who wrote it, but they kept reading it and said, this has the voice of God behind it. And the church broadly accepts and rejects something. So is there room? There is not definitive proof. God doesn't come down and put a watermark on his particular original manuscripts to say, this is mine. Okay, you can fool with it, but this is still mine.
Well, I think with these conversations that we have, and it's around this stuff, this TikTok trend or whatever, is facing us in culture. Yeah. A lot of times it feels like, depending on which side of the argument you fall on, right, it feels like a justification for one's personal actions, right, or beliefs or orientation in this case. Yep. So how do we how do we engage with this culturally? I think that's the question a lot of Christians are having, because on one hand, if you just get out there and go, no, you're wrong, well, then you're not inviting a conversation. You're also going to get labeled as a bigot or whatever else. So
this is true.
How do we have thoughtful conversations with people around this? Because even from what you've shared, I'm kind of going, okay, well, I could tell that to somebody, but they might just say, well, that's one guy's opinion.
Right. Well, the next issue that comes up with things like who has authority to say anything about anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the problem with TikTok is, and a lot of the social media is, you can take a 10-year-old boy and publish an article, which is just craziness. And but because you don't know who actually posted it, it still sounds reasonable. A lot of things sound reasonable. I mean, you can find smart people who believe anything. Mm-hmm. The world's flat kind of stuff, I guess. So the value of people who actually do know what they're talking about. And in academics, everything's public. Yeah. You discuss things in a public forum. Right now, we live in a tribalized world where we gun to our corners and we hurl hand grenades at the other guy, thinking we're scoring points. The other guy barely even notices you're talking to him because they're busy talking out of their own area. So the ability in an academic community to have a genuine conversation and be able to go out and have a cup of coffee afterwards is not currently where our culture is. Yeah. But the idea of why does the Bible talk about the value of teachers? Because somebody knows something. They spent years at it, and then they talk to you about it. And our job is not to simply say, okay, you're an idiot because you don't agree with me. Our job is, how do we consider that? So when Dan Brown writes a book on the Da Vinci Code, that was popular maybe 20 years ago. I remember a guy, my daughter's orthodontist comes to me and says, have you read this book? And I said, I had not. I just got finished translating from the Coptic out of the Gospel of Mary and some stuff out of the Gospel of Truth. And he said, you ought to go read this because it's interesting. I read it and I thought, I came away from that book feeling stupider when I was done, having already done work on some of the materials. And it was creative, but I don't know more than 2 or 3 scholars in the world that actually, at least in the academy, that actually buy that. They just didn't. So they realized, how do you get scholars to actually have a conversation and talk about it and begin to respect authorities again without asserting, I'm in charge, I'm the boss, you need to believe me. The scholars typically don't do that. They want to hack it out.
Well, and I think we're looking at this thing where in culture we're probably in a postmodern world, and people are starting to rely much more on emotion,
right?
And that's the guiding compass of their decisions. But then if you look at someone who is maybe in a homosexual lifestyle, they're married, they've established a life for themselves, maybe they've adopted kids, whatever that might look like, and then what they're feeling is then the church is telling them that's wrong, you're going to hell. Yep. Kind of a stance. So. And maybe this is something. The argument could be made that maybe they're starting to search for faith, and now they're going, okay, but this is the life I've established, and now this organization is telling me wrong. And then you've got things like, okay, there's a whole documentary now that's telling me this is okay, and it just, you start meddling into people's lives and uprooting it. And I think Jesus does that normally. That's just kind of his MO.
Yeah,
but when we're kind of his minions, like, how are we honoring that work, and how do we cautiously approach that?
Well, gosh, you're opening a whole series of cans of worms. Let me suggest this.
Sorry, I'll put the can opener back in the drawer.
It's okay. I don't mind. I think of it in terms like this. And anytime we engage this discussion, we're asking the question: what produces maximum human flourishing? Now, you can go wherever you like with that. But I think I want to know, what's the next best step for an individual.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a gay couple with a child, and I want to talk carefully in here because I don't even know that as a church we've kind of resolved all this stuff, but wants to come in and serve in the church in some fashion, I want to know, what is the next most redemptive step they can take.
Yeah.
Not because I have to change them, because in my world, I think truth helps, but carefully and gently applied. But the Spirit of God is the one that changes that stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't have to say, okay, you're gay, you need to split. Mm-hmm. I realize I've just stepped over all kinds of lines at that point. But what I'm mostly concerned is, what's the next redemptive step that individual can take to walk with the Lord as best as possible. I know when I was in college, one of the guys I got to know, and this is sometime back before the flood, I think, One of the guys I got to know was a serious drug dealer. He was the kind of guy that you could actually smell him as he was coming up the elevator because he reeked of that stuff. And that guy became a believer. It was about 3 months before he realized that, okay, if I'm going to be a drug dealer, I need to cut this drug more carefully and honestly. That's where he was. It's what he's coming from. Oh, and he realized about a year later he wasn't supposed to be sleeping with his girlfriend. I mean, you have to start where people are and realize, okay, this is the standard. Jesus welcomes you, but he never leaves you where you are.
Yeah.
But it's not our job to shove people down the aisle. Our job is to love people with the love of Christ and show them this is what Jesus is like and model what healthy relationships look like. So that's why I'm a little concerned, but if we bash away.
I think that's good.
I think for me, one of my deadliest sins probably is the fact that I don't want anybody to say because I told you so. Like I'm not like, oh, because the Bible said so and therefore I should do it. Like I think a lot of millennials and even more so Gen Z are a little more angsty about that approach that maybe former generations were okay with. Yet at the same time, I want the best answer, the easiest, And so it seems like in some ways those are at odds at different times because I want the best information, but I want somebody else to go mine it for me, right? And so, and I don't want to know because I told you so. And so sometimes it feels like those two can, be at odds, and we have a whole up and coming generation that's probably a little bit more angsty like I am. That's like, no, I want a real reason, for these things, but there's a lot of scholars, there's a lot of work done. I don't have time to mine all of that kind of stuff. And so how do we minister? How do we begin to minister to, I don't want to call them lazy, but people that, want answers, but want that mind for them in some kind of ways? Because this is complex stuff. Like for me to go become an expert in this, good luck. I don't have the brain wired for it, you know? And so how do we start to minister in that kind of context?
Well, if I can say it this way, I think most pastors' job is to translate the higher level of academics, if I can say that, into normal lay people. They're not stupid. They just don't have the vocabulary and the context in which to understand. So part of a job of a pastor is to make real what the scholars are doing. And there's no way that I can see to get around that. Otherwise, I'm just sort of blowing smoke. I'm the next man of power. That's Nietzschean world. Who has the most power wins, and who yells the loudest wins. And we're right in the middle of that cultural context. Sex, power, and money. Who's wealthy? Who's got the power? Who can influence? That and so forth. So I do think I don't think there's any way to solve all that. To be honest with you, because people are still attracted to authoritarian. We know that in the Christian community, authoritarian leaders tend to attract. They tend to elevate inside the Christian church. We like certainty. We're not as happy when people are less certain about things. To say, "Thus says the Lord," is a really heavy burden. But people would prefer, for the most part, somebody to be able to say, "Thus says the Lord." They want to know that what they're being told is the truth, because they don't. If you start undermining what I believe, I mean, either I got to step away and deal with it, or I'm going to collapse. Or something about my system collapses. So we want some certainty, and interestingly enough, I'm not sure the Scripture gives us as much certainty as we wish we had. There's a lot of things we don't know for sure. We come up with confessional statements because we want to know what the centers of these things are, but around the edges, we see wisdom literature. Is it better to talk to a fool according to a fool, or is it better to be quiet around a fool, not to reaffirm him? And the answer is those two verses sit next to each other. It's a nice way of saying circumstances and situation will dictate that sometimes you got to hit a guy over the head with a 2x4, and sometimes you just need to say, I'm not going to bother to engage. You know that because you're on social media. Sometimes you engage it because they need to be hit over the head, and sometimes you just ignore it.
But I think that sometimes that gives people with the thought that they have the knowledge, the authority to judge other people. And I think that some people are looking for the truth and they want to come and hear the truth, but also have this in tandem. I'm not judged, or I'm not condemning you because I'm sharing the truth. And I think that is where
Right.
things are missed.
Right.
And
I
where
love you.
yeah.
I love you, so I'm going to beat you over the head with the truth.
Yeah.
So you have that in Ephesians, the language of truthing in love. We would say speaking the truth typically. It's literally a participle. Truthing in love. It's just one of those things that we like to lean one way or the other. We're either too permissive or we want to be truthful and blast away. I'm not buying it. I mean, in Romans, he's going to say, I'm convinced that you're full of goodness, you're capable of admonition, and really able to love and do those things. I need all of those things. If I don't have any love and I just admonish away, I'm just blasting away.
Yeah.
But if I have only love and I don't have a way to tell truth, then I'm sounding wimpy in a culture that prefers wimp right now.
I think even my personal struggle is when we're trying to reach people outside of our faith community to make sure it doesn't feel like a bait and switch.
Right.
Because I think even, let them discover that, let Jesus do the work, right? And let them discover what they can and not have me just tell them everything.
Yeah.
But it's like if ultimately though, in the back of our heads, we're going, well, really the thing is you should separate and you should, whatever. If kind of the ultimate thing is this is what my Bible's telling me, how do we invite people along that journey and without those preconceived notions? This is going to be the most juvenile example ever, but I'm going to share it anyways because I was just thinking about this story. When I was a kid, I hated beans. No matter what anyone would say or do, my parents would try to get me to eat beans. I would not eat beans. I thought they were like bugs because they had that skin texture and that mushy on the inside. I thought it was awful. I still don't.
Cream filled.
I still don't really love like pinto beans, kidney beans. Anyways, my dad was famous for his chili. He's pastoring a church. He'd always chili. Everybody raved about his chili. And I remember my mom was out of town. Dad was making chili. I said, "Hey, Dad, can you pour a bowl of chili for me before you put the beans in it, just so I can have it?" He looked at me in disappointment and said yes. Later that evening, I ate the whole bowl of beans. And I mean, not a bowl of beans, chili, right? Said it was delicious. Went on with my evening. I was probably in the third grade. Like days later, he said, well, that chili you ate, Mom had some leftover refried beans in the fridge. And so I smeared the whole bottom of the bowl with those. And then put the chili on top, and you gobbled it all down without any complaint. And to him, that like in the moment, that was a victory, right? Like, see, you like beans, yeah, And sometimes I feel like that's what, like, when we aren't honest as a church about what we don't know, we're doing that in a way. Like, see, you like it, And so it's just this. I think a lot of times there needs to be more room and more open discussion about, hey, there are some things we're uncertain about, but we know that the Holy Spirit convicts, and we know that Jesus loves you, and we know that when you encounter Jesus, your life is going to change, and we can't control what that's going to look like, And so it's like we can be honest about that, but in some ways, I feel like we want to still have the reins,
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, I think in a post modern world, I think the strongest testimony you have is your life.
Yeah.
When you flourish or when you get hurt and you have to grieve, how do you behave and how do you grieve? So when my university disappears and I'm out of a job, one of my agenda items that my wife and I talked about was, I don't want my kids to see us as being angry with God beyond what's necessary and failing to trust God for the next step. I want them to see us work through the process. I think we did that, but because we didn't know for a year what was going to happen, as far as job opportunities. And I wanted the kids to see us that, when it was not so easy, how do you walk with Jesus? And how do you walk in a way to watch him and then watch them grow in their trust as well? Yeah. That Jesus can do this thing. And by the way, suffering and headaches like that are common to everybody. So, if there's a message from the Psalms or any one of wisdom literature, is that nobody's immune. Yeah. Everybody gets into that trouble. So that's that. We've gone a way astray from issues like textual criticism and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, life is that complicated. And I think that's the most effective witness that you're going to have. Words matter. You still use the truth. The language for declaring the truth is still verbal. And yet, people will see the hypocrisy almost immediately. It's a big smoke screen. And my neighbors, I want them to understand that I love Christ and I like them. They're fun. And even though they're not necessarily in the same faith camp that I am. And I want them to see our family, and I want them to see us have fun, and I want to have fun with them.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, along with the words matter, that they do. But my job is not to hit them over the head with a 2x4.
Wow.
You seeker-sensitive guy.
Well, I'm not convinced that church seeker-sensitive is as effective as we used to think it was. I mean, I think we've been through that field before, but I want to, in my neighborhood, I want to be that way. Mm-hmm. In my normal day-to-day interaction, whether I'm playing at a gym or something like that, I want people to enjoy, and that I'm a relatively normal person who actually has all the rest of the screwball things, but that my faith and my commitments actually shape how I do life. Because theirs do. Yeah. Their faith commitments shape how they do life. How's it working for you? Yeah. Sometimes it's working great. Sometimes it doesn't always work great for me. But I get to the end of the day. That's why I could go home and read some of those texts and still hear from God, even though someone just convinced me or made a convincing argument that wasn't. But I read it and I go, okay, there's more going on here. The Spirit of God is actually speaking through this text and so forth.
You got to listen.
I do.
Yeah. You
I do.
Yeah. Well, Karl, I think we went all over this subject, but I do think that we landed somewhere substantial. So I really appreciate your time and for just sharing your heart with us and your mind. Both the head and the heart together, working together today. So it's good.
The word cardia and the nous are very intimately connected, and we can split them apart. But I'm hoping my residents understand that my brain and my heart are there both together.
Yeah.
So I don't want them to see just an egghead or just a sloppy guy.
Yeah.
It's emotionally sloppy.
Love it. All right. Well, if you have any questions or concerns, you can send those to Karl
directly
P.
to me. I can see it now. Yeah, don't send them to those guys.
No, but you can email us at podcast@cccomaha.org, or you can reach out to us on social media on Instagram and the infamous TikTok at CCCOMA Podcast, or you can leave us a voicemail 402-885-9930. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we'll talk to you then.